All right. Yeah, so the Eucharist that you brought up, Evan, this is, obviously the central ritual in Christianity, right? I mean, being in a more theological program, in a more theological place, Boston College, yourself, I'm curious what you think about that, because, when I think of ritual, I think of liturgy, and I try to get more and more into thinking about liturgy, especially because of figures like Conrad-Martius, who's a sort of, what is she, like a kind of Baptist figure, the Schobdach circle is her group.
Are there any Baptists in Europe? You sure they're not Reformed?
Okay, well, not Baptist. I don't know, what do you call that?
Reformed. I don't think there are any Baptists in Europe.
Yeah, what's interesting? Franz Xavier von Baader. Is that someone any of you are familiar with?
Von Baader.
He had a lot to say about Reformation. There's not really a lot of literature out there on him, interestingly, but this book on neo-Calvinism and in early Christian theosophy, like pre-Blavatsky theosophy, right, is about Franz Xavier von Baader and some other figures whose names I will not attempt to pronounce, but these guys were a big influence, at least von Baader was a big influence on Conrad-Martius. He's mentioned in Hart's text, and he's also influential by way of certain other figures, and in particular, Clemens Brentano. So he's kind of like looming over the Brentano school, of which Husserlian phenomenology is one branch, So anyway, I mean, he's like a few skips and jumps away from Husserl, but what's interesting in his work is it's all about this center periphery schema, about the soul and the body, but also time and eternity. And Bill's questions about the relationship between the philosophy of time in Edith Stein, Time and Eternity, and Conrad-Martius is relevant on this point as well. He's not very well known, but his whole thing is this center periphery schema. So I also highly recommend this book. And then, generally, like, these are important figures in Calvinism, what's called neo-Calvinism, or as it's explained early on, it's kind of like an anti-Calvinist stance, Reformationist stance. I'm not really an expert in all of these areas, but I just got into von Baader, and this author actually has some other works, which I happen to have right here as well. Yeah, Glenn has these books on Christian non-dualism in the Jewish context, and he has some Eastern philosophy. I can't read it when I'm looking at it backwards on the screen. Abi, that guy.
Oh, right? Jim Hart is really interested in Henri Lassalle.
Okay.
It definitely raised that with him, and he's going to get really excited if you hear that.
Yeah. So this is a lot of homework that I just got myself, but there's that. Yeah. And I wanted to mention to you, Evan, about the topic of, you just brought up, what was it? One of the topics you brought up, speech act theory, right? In the context of the Eucharist. It'd be really interesting to look at Reinach's work, which is also not very well expressed, not too many books out there, but this one by one of the former presidents of the North American Society for Early Phenomenology, Kimberly Baltzar-Jarret. This book, I just finally got it myself, Doorway to the World of Essences, Adolf Reinach and the Early Phenomenological Movement. Reinach is all about he's a very early important figure in speech act theory.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay, there we are.
And he's influenced by the Austrian school. Wittgenstein is also a member of this general vicinity of philosophers, steeped in the tradition of realist ontology, those Austrians. His whole thing is taking off from a critique of the Kantian synthetic a priori. He's all about states of affairs and speech act theory, but it comes down to essences. And his work, as we've seen in Hart's book, is very influential for Conrad-Martius. He was a Privatdozent early on in Göttingen. He came from the what's it called? The school of, who's that guy who sent all those folks over to Göttingen? You guys know what I'm talking about? Is it Munich? Anyway, he's a really important figure to look at. I think that a lot of what makes Conrad-Martius and Edith Stein and a lot of these thinkers unique in their phenomenological stance comes from Reinach and John Herring. John Herring is a very theological thinker, but a lot of them take off on the idea of the basic phenomenological elements, the essence, the idea of this Wesen, how it relates to like a Platonic essence. Professor Baltzar-Jarret here argues that it's not Platonism in the sense of the charge of Platonism that's being leveled against a number of other thinkers who are dealing with essences at that time. My personal stance is that what we call Platonism is very different from what really should be called Platonism, maybe. So, I mean, it's interesting, and I know that he has Reinach has this idea of the essence has also an essence kern, a core. Yeah, Sally.
I find this so interesting. And when you're talking, okay, I don't know any of these books, I've written them down, but I would be curious to know if in the indexes, if in any of those books that you've just cited, they have an entry on Palamas, Gregory Palamas from the 1300s, who in the 1300s, in the Great Hesychast controversy, he articulated the Eastern Orthodox position on existence, and he makes the big distinction between essences and energies. And I mean, this just blows my mind because we've got relatively contemporary philosophers. I mean, I'm just really interested if they've got Palamas in the indexes. It's just fascinating.
That's interesting. I never thought.
Palamas, he's like one of my heroes. Writing in the 1300s.
Yeah, it's written by someone named Sally Stocksdale. Is who wrote that book. Okay.
Evans established in the Aeonic World-Periphery. Yeah, Sally, do it. Do you have a recommendation for?
My problem is I have so many ideas and just like I move like worse than a turtle. But yes.
Well, I'm really interested in this essence energy. I mean, this is
Plato
and Aristotle all over.
One of the best summaries I've ever read. I've got a printout of a book. After we get done with her, or I'll go get it and I'll enter it here.
Yeah.
Fabulous chapter where she just absolutely just explains it clearly and breaks it down. And I'll go look it up here and it's right at my fingertips.
Oh, very good.
It's fabulous.
The main thing I wanted to finally, initially, and I'll say finally after all this other stuff that we talked about, recommend for any kind of thinking about the Eucharist is, and this is also just like the topic of the Eucharist, very relevant to today's stuff, is the work of my teacher, Peter Manchester. In fact, the title of his 2005 book, The Syntax of Time, this is his very specific translation of the old Greek Anaximander phrase, taxis, the word taxis in the famous fragment, which is in our reading for today. And so that's what this is all about. And this is in my work on academia and in a few publications, I often will compare Peter Manchester's thought with Conrad-Martius and others because his work is all about the phenomenological and real-ontological, although he doesn't use that phrase, structure of time, that is of real time and of the transcendental imaginative dimension, where the Husserlian phenomenology of inner time consciousness is inscribed in the intersection of these as being a twofold diagram. And that's also exactly what we're dealing with in Conrad-Martius's diagram in a sort of different way, but maybe also in a way that can be synthesized, just like the thought of Husserl on the phenomenology of inner time consciousness and the work of Conrad-Martius on time and eternity that is already expressed in 1927, but then is also expressed later in Die Zeit in the 1950s in the work on space-time. This also can be harmonized with Husserlian phenomenology. So, I mean, there's like obvious connections that need to be made phenomenologically among the key figures of phenomenology here, but also ontologically and real-ontologically, and also in this broader theological context, which is not where a lot of the work in phenomenology usually goes. I mean, I guess you can't really say that. Like, there is, of course, plenty, but in the way that Conrad-Martius is writing in this chapter in particular, after we've been introduced to this really far out, I mean, these categories, right? Like this diagram, all these far out categories with the or ether, kind of being spelled out in a different way as this Aeonic World-Periphery, like this. This stuff is far out, and in this last section of chapter 5, we're getting it expressed in this really concrete imagery of the coming eon, and how it has these characteristics like coming from the tradition of like Augustine, Aquinas, etc., that matter itself will radiate. What was the thing about it'll be perfectly interpenetrable? I don't know what code that would be. Walk through walls.
That might be a good place for us just to begin to dive into the text here with that figure on what was it, 182, the one you had just held up, the figure 5.1, the model of the space-time union, for those with your books. What did you guys read was going on there, and what do you see, and what was your reception of sort of this idea as it was presented?
Jeremy, did we get to a conclusion?
Isn't this where Bill, I think we closed out our last meeting talking about that, right? I mean, we're literally, Bill was concerned about it, as we all were, interpreting that.
Yeah, I mean, we had a few goes at it, and so I mean, I think some of it is like, well, I mean, let's just look at it, right? Like, here's this world disk or world slice. So in some sense, this circle on this diagram, clearly it's a circle, but she uses the word cylinder. So we are to consider this is a three-dimensional sort of depiction. Whereas she says this is a two-dimensional one. So it's kind of like a ball moving in a cylinder, but maybe not a ball, to be really, really literal. Maybe it's she uses the phrase world disk, world slice, so anyway, there's this, but I mean, bear in mind at all points, as she does, as Hart points out in the beginning, and as folks like Einstein and anyone who invokes some kind of diagram of space and time and other dimensions, there's just a schematic. So it's just there to indicate that which cannot be said, right? The oracle at Delphi gives a sign. There's a certain point, especially when we're trying to point to intuitions that we can't have in the same way that we can have other space-time intuitions, like the thing in space-time. We can't have a four-dimensional depiction of it, but I mean, mathematical intuition tells us there is a four-dimensional version. It may not be spelled out in an actual existence according to our senses. We can't verify it like that, right? But so, I mean, we have to wrestle with these kind of schematics. So the way it works is this is the world disk or world slice, she calls it. And it's different than the world center. In our text, this is the world's soul. Okay, she does say world soul, and she says that I'm going to point right here at the outer periphery of this one, although it might equally be the periphery in the sense of both sides, where the world disk touches at this touching point, that all of this periphery is the world's spirit. Okay, so somewhere strung between this primary spirit, primordial soul over here, and primordial spirit down here, the two formal roots, right? Is that how it works? Yeah, these are the two material roots. Remember, her system of polarities is how, I mean, we'll see that especially when we get to the appendix. You know, there's this system of polarities. These are the material roots, and these are the formal roots. And we're, you know, this is the actual now. Das aktuelle jetzt, you know, Aktualität jetzt, right? And then let's see, we got the Weltzentrum, so world center, aka, as it's spelled out very clearly in the text, we could be sure about this identification with the world soul, and the Aeonic World-Periphery, Aeonische Peripherie, Raumzeit, you know, so, and then we have these diagrams. So, I mean these arrows. So, I mean, our world, you know, somehow spins around this Aeonic World-Periphery in a higher dimension. That's the point. So, like, one of the last pages that we read for today, so working backwards, oh, it's page 198, for instance, it says, returning to this model, which appeared in the previous section, page 198 at the bottom, the model of the three-dimensional Aeonic wheel and the two-dimensional world disk does not have any applicability with respect to an already integrated world. It refers only to the present disintegral world. Okay, so this is talking about, you know, this idea of an integral, you know, an integral world, which you find in Christian theology as well as in many other traditions. And earlier on the page, this is kind of going off topic, but I do want to get here at some point, if not right now. Earlier up on that same page 198, Hart mentions how Conrad-Martius is talking about something in Eliade, when Buddha is described as passing through the 7 planetary cosmic levels by ritually taking 7 steps, and says, I am the highest in the world, or the Bodhisattva's ritual call, I am the oldest. You know, this is a kind of non-temporal place. In the language of von Bader, it's a supra-temporal place. He has this category of time, eternity, and in between there's a supra-temporal too. So there's another direction to go with, if that's not enough categories of temporality and eternity. But what's interesting is the number 7 here, you know, is coming from this this broader tradition of cyclical time, the Yuga system in you know, in Eastern philosophy. The Chaldeans, the Zoroastrian literature has the same kind of numbers, the same kind of specific proportions to describe the different ages of the world. And in the Christian context, there are these 3 ages that are referred to. You know, the time before creation, the time between the beginning and the end of creation, so this epoch, this aeon, and then the world to come. So that's the schematic context in which this world to come, this integral world that was the intention, the original plan of creation before the fall, will eventually be fulfilled. That's the schematic of this cosmology of history in terms of Christianity. That's the stuff that Conrad-Martius is dealing with. But she also brings up in a sort of perennialist philosophical tendency that you see in a number of thinkers at that time, and in German philosophy generally, like Schopenhauer early on was reading the Upanishads. You know, this she's always tying in this idea of Buddhism and certain thoughts in Vedanta. She refers to the book There's a few German books that she refers to. I got a couple of them to like see what they're like, you know, how they get the Eastern philosophy, if they're representing it well. Looks I don't know, pass my initial test. You know, so she invokes these things a lot, including like in Die Zeit at the end. She's talking about the Weltmaya, you know, the phenomenal world being this. She uses the phrase Weltmaya, so the world illusion, you know, samsara. And I mean, her stuff is like totally amenable to that kind of perspective when you look at it. So somehow we have to situate that kind of narrative, that kind of cosmology of history, this like broader than just the Christian kind, into the Christian one that we're looking at, this like threefold. So in this broader stuff though, it's often talking about the 4 ages of the world, and that's in the context of 3 which came before, and we're at the crossing point in the 4th one. So there's a system of 7, and anyway, I mean, not to get too far out into like numerology about it, because she's not even really talking about that. I mean, she's talking about like the integral world to come, you know. But I do think it's important to situate it in this broader context. This one right here explains it real well. René Guénon, Traditional Forms and Cosmic Cycles. He goes into, I think, from what I've found of like the readable literature, there's probably more technical astrological literature out there, but the most accessible description of the Mahavantras and the yugas that they consist of, and these are like the breathing in and out of Brahman, and it corresponds to, as we go around the galaxy, our solar system also bobs up and down, and as it does that, when we are, I think they generally agree, when we're hit in the middle of this galactic plane, it's a Satya Yuga, or a golden age. Guénon also corresponds this with the 4 ages of like gold, silver, whatever the 3rd one is, and iron, you know, in the Greek tradition. So that's the good stuff. That's the integral plan. Like that's where we are supposed to be. It's our proper place. But we also bob up and down as we go around, and each one of those being ultimately far away is a dark age. Astronomically, it's called the solar apex, and the one opposite where you are, that's the solar anapex. So there is
I'm not so sure that that's really what she's talking about.
Well, she's not. I know I said she's not. She's talking about the 3, the Christian 3.
But then the 3 ages, the reason why she has an interpretation of what it means that we are not living in an integral world. And from what I got so far, what she means is it's really quite remarkable, questioning the very nature of time. Why is it that time is the way it is? Why does the passing of time always mean a loss? And why is it that, in some sense, a loss? And why is it that, and now even to define what we're talking about here is really hard, but why is it that we even have these paradoxes of the now, which is at once a razor's edge, and yet at the same time inclusive of everything? And we have this sort of sense that, yes, it must include everything, and it is all there, but how should I put it? And yet at the same time, it doesn't. And it's like when she looks, I think, when she looks at our attempts to try to understand time, we do run up against these paradoxes and these puzzles that now, for example, like I just said, now is both all-inclusive and ever the same, and yet, from another point of view, is a mere razor's edge and is passing. and we can somehow never really reconcile these, and to even call it a way of looking at it is, I don't even know what you call it when we're even trying to understand these things, but it's something. And it's not like we have no understanding, because it really does seem like time, that now is, the presence is permanent and unchanging, and that we do have some intuition that the time that is passing is within an unchanging present, and that we somehow participate in that present. But then what do we mean by saying we participate in it? And we're not sure. And maybe another way, I think what she's also trying to say is, why is it that time has the character of flowing away and lost, which it does? And couldn't there be another, and it's really quite remarkable, questioning that maybe time could be somehow fundamentally different from what it is. And that's what she means by, that's one of her ways of understanding what Christianity might be talking about in all these references to the new heaven and the new earth, and that somehow the resurrected Christ is already there among us. And how do we understand that?
I think, Jeremy, you're talking exactly what I want to talk about. And I've been pressing Jim on this as much as I can, and I still don't think I got a clear answer. So what you have to be careful about is you have to make these distinctions between what she calls passing time, as I understand it, that's transcendental time. That's an imaginative creation. And that's what we experience as humans. And whether we could imagine it some other way, I don't know. I don't know why not. But then there's also this other time, which is the time that's the time before time, or whatever you want to call it, the Aeonic time, whatever you want to call it. And so this is I want to just try to describe this, because really it's this last chapter that forces me, and I'm trying to ask him this, and he will not answer me plainly, is whether there's something like an absolute past. Because there's this one sentence in the text where he says that Conrad-Martius has been claimed as believing in an absolute time, but he never really answers that question. And she really does seem to feel like, to me, that she does believe in an absolute time. And so the thing is that, so I have this feeling that what these wheels are, there's this thing going. I'm going to try to start from the beginning, because I wanted to say this until I wanted everyone to say you're wrong. So, because the thing is, what we have are these entelecchies, these essences, and these are absolute things. These are eternal things, whatever they are. They're eternal possibilities. And what is being realized in the world has something to do with the state that the world is in, because human freedom and the contingencies of the world all are relevant in what is actually realized. But so then this wheel of going around is still, nonetheless, there's a doomsday clock of sorts going on here, because it's irrevocable that at some point there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, or something like that. There's going to be a change of eons. That's going to happen. It's irrevocable. When it happens, no one knows. I'm not even sure the clock knows. So because it depends on something, what's happening in this world. Does any of this make any sense? Because that's how I'm reading what she's saying.
There's an interesting confluence. Well, let's locate the text. I don't know if this is
this is hard to do.
Well, that's okay. Let me read something about end of 199, starting Christ's reality. I'll read this paragraph. It might not exactly be, but we'll land half the plane at least. Christ's reality derives from grace and sacred history. not from cosmological history. So there we do see that distinction. Nevertheless, Christ as the new Adam is the full meaning of Aeonic world powers. That is, Christ does not belong to natura naturans, actually, but only as its full gracious potential meaning. So now we have that Aristotelian language coming in between, potential and what am I thinking of? Well, yes, with the final coming of Christ and the resurrection of the saints at the conclusion of temporal time, there will be realized the integral Aeonic world as the new, never before actualized, mystical body of Christ. So there's something going on there. Thus, Conrad-Martius argues for a cyclical view of time, in the sense that the end of temporal time realizes the potential significance of Aeonic time. So potentiality plays in there. She believed the authentic eschatological hope was in the cosmic physical reestablishment of the paradisial man through the coming of Christ. Thereby would all creation be removed from the valley of tears, and there would be a new heaven and a new earth. This is a return to creation's seminal reasons. So there's a return, and she talks about reasons. She mentioned St. Augustine. But on the next page, then 200 says, but there's a genuine novum as well. So there's a return, but a novum in the course of history, and that the great grace-oriented world periphery has not yet been actualized. In Christ's final coming, he will fully actualize the full meaning of the cosmos. So when I was reading that, it seems like she locates eschatology within the body of Christ, not necessarily the body of a first century Jewish man, but in fact in the mystical body of Christ as this sort of gap between utter and absolute actual potentiality, and then essentially the second coming of Christ is the shift from Christ as potential to Christ as actual. Question mark at the end of that statement. That seems to be what she's saying. What do y'all think?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely an excellent representation of what she's saying. I mean, and then there's Boethius, eternity is the full possession of eternal life, full actual possession of unlimited life. And
there's also written into this the sense that some evangelicals have, I don't, but some people do, that we can hasten the return of Christ. In fact, many Muslims have the same belief. And so I wonder if there's some sense in which she is also agreeing with that notion.
Yeah, well, she says in here that our deeds, our will and our deeds, doesn't she? I think she's, I'll have to search the word deed, but I think I read that recently in here, have something to do with that. I mean, I've been reading a lot of different kind of things this morning, but in this book, just to go back to this real quick, Guénon says that if someone were to figure out the exact correspondence between this spiritual timeline in this system, it's the up and down as we go around, and correspond it to years, then you win the jackpot. You can win every lotto. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of secrecy in some of the more esoteric, figurings out of this stuff. So that there is like a kind of structure of nature, or history of the cosmos. I don't know what you'd call that, but there's a structure of nature to like these, especially if you think of it like us going around the galaxy, having dark ages and alternative, ages of light and effulgence, spiritual light, or enlightenment. There's this aspect of it, but then there's also the human will. And I think the point of a lot of this kind of perspective on this sort of spiritual literature is that our will is going to reflect that light, whatever light we receive. The proposition, the famous proposition 2 of the Book of the 24 Philosophers, God is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and periphery is nowhere, is a very powerful image. Okay, I refer to it myself a lot, but there's also this proposition 24 of the 24 propositions in the book of the 24 philosophers. And it runs something like this. God is a light that is not reflected or refracted the way light that we experience is, but a kind of absolute light. You know, so if you think of God as an infinite sphere, then the light that it shines in all directions from its center, it has an absolute center. It's different from the Newtonian absolute, of course, you know, but there's an absolute center, an absolute periphery, and the unrefracted light, I think that's the Latin, the unrefracted light would be absolute, and it would lay out a schema, a plan that would be perfect fulfillment, and it wouldn't just be like partial fulfillment. I think we can use the Husserlian logical investigations language, not just partial fulfillment of noematic contents, but real fulfillment, something the likes of which we maybe can't even imagine, you know, where we're at now. But she always talks about the meaning cosmos.
I'd like to say something about, because it strikes me, if this idea that we're running around the galaxy, or in the plane or out of the plane, that has significant impact upon life, whatever, if that's true, then all of our understanding of modern physics is wrong.
Not necessarily.
Well, not all of it. It's just that it's wholly inadequate. And I think I actually have to say it's wrong. Because the only thing that they would say would be some sort of gravitational effect, something like that. I'm willing to accept that. I'm just saying that it would put all of modern physics in the dustbin.
Well,
See, their point is it doesn't. There's a lot of spiritual scientific literature from the anthroposophists and the students of Steiner, other not.
Well, then they're not in the modern consensus.
that might be a better way of saying, because
Well, but the thing is, Conrad-Martius is one of, she's synthesizing it, you know, and she's representing this view of the Kritischer Realismus folks, like, you know, there's a number of people who belonged to this school of critical realism in Germany at the time. Hart mentions there's Conrad-Martius, Whitehead, and there's another great philosopher of nature. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but he's a member of this school. Her friend Alois Wenzel. They're all about integrating spiritual, you know, perspectives such as these, which are in the air at the time, with contemporary science. I mean, so I think it's a really important point that it doesn't just throw all of science out the window. It absolutely does not.
No, what it does is it tells modern science is that, and I've been saying this forever, is that all you're doing is scratching the surface, and you're not, and that's all science ever does.
Well, that's good.
And that beneath the surface is something far more interesting and powerful than what you know of.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is true. I think that is what philosophy has to contribute to science. Wherever there's that division, you know, they should be integrated. And I think that the transcendental, as we call it, in many different ways and with many different attitudes, you know, it crops up in different ways, is has a lot to contribute to any kind of empirically based thinking. And anytime you have empirically based thinking, it's not necessarily, you know, what Husserl calls positivism, like Humean, you know, Mach, Cornelius, all the folks that he's critiquing in the logical investigations. It's not always like that. Maybe the most positivistic is like the logical positivism. You know, it's always a mix of the transcendental or spiritual attitude and the you know, earthly grounded sense-based experience of the body that contemporary science is often like identified with, because that's the dominant attitude. But there's also, especially in phenomenology, this transcendental dimension. You know, it's really coming from Kant, but I mean, his transcendental idealism is immediately set in check, you know, with all this tradition of transcendental realism or real idealism, like Fichte, and a lot of critical realists that come after that. And that's what Conrad-Martius is a part of. D'Albert has a list of critical realists, and Conrad-Martius is at the top of them. But they're all about integrating these things. So it's not an antagonism, you know, it can be, we have to bring them together, you know, and I think that's what's really exciting about Conrad-Martius, is that she's doing all of this, so many different fields of science in the contemporary mode, you know, using all the contemporary everything, you know, she's doing contemporary science, but she's starting from the ground up in a very philosophical way, basing it in like the Aristotelian ideas, like that time is an image of eternity, for instance. That's the real relevant one here. And you know, it's so you call it spirituality. I mean, here in the Phenomenology of Religious Experience, we often call that transcendental stuff spirituality, but of course there's like logic and mathematics. These things have transcendental elements. They don't necessarily have to, you know, there's lots of debate about like, what is a number? Is it like a collection of sense objects, or, you know, is it an essence, right? That's kind of at the core of what Husserl was up to. And there's a lot of interesting literature, you know, in that like philosophy of mathematics and phenomenology. Husserl being a student of Kroninger, and Hilbert being at Göttingen, and some of the students being students of both. So anyway, I think it's important to keep in mind.
I'd like to get back to the text. I'm going to start on page 196, because this is something to do with the question I kept pressing Jim on. In the beginning of the, am I echoing? This is the beginning of the first paragraph, where he talks about the cosmology of history. The world periphery is in a sense programmed, and he puts programmed in quotes. And the reason it's in quotes is that it's not strictly programmed. It's dependent upon human freedom and the interaction with the world, and the like. So the question that I kept pressing Jim on is that if the nows, I mean, I don't really understand these nows. There are lots of problems I have with these nows, but if there's nows, and there is a history of these nows, then it's a succession of nows. If there's a succession of nows, then there's a before and an after. And if there's a before and after, then there's a past now and even a future now. So I want to ask, first of all, if that makes sense to anybody.
I think he would, partly Husserl certainly agrees with that. I think a lot of where Jim is coming from is Husserl's phenomenology of time consciousness. Both.
Why would you want to bring that up? That's transcendental time.
But it's related to what Conrad-Martius is talking about.
Oh, it is. Okay.
And if you want to ask what Hart thinks, that's where he comes from. And I think that this does, and frankly, I'm not quite sure what she means by transcendental time either.
It's
I guess it probably pretty much she's referring to what Husserl is talking about in his phenomenology of time consciousness.
That's what I think. That's what I think.
But I think that, and then there's this interesting thing that she talks about now as being quantized. And I find that both interesting and frustrating. And I'm not completely on top of this either, but I feel like she's being kind of evasive in a certain way, because really we're looking at I think we're looking at a paradox that we really can't get past. And I don't think she's acknowledging openly enough that she really is talking about an insurmountable paradox. And the insurmountable paradox, I think, has to do with exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. And for example, we have the sense that we're always in now, on the one hand, and the time is somehow flowing through the now, and the things really do start, you know. And so in a sense, there really are I think there are distinct moments that we can objectively identify, namely the moment at which something starts. But and this is incredible, but as soon as we try to understand what we mean by time flowing and experiencing time and experiencing the past, it quickly becomes this tangle. And so I think one of the reasons why it's a tangle is that I don't think, there are things that I don't think we can separate. On the one hand, there clearly is a sense in which there are definite moments in time, and that something new could start at any moment. And I think in that sense, we can objectively grasp a now, namely the very moment something starts. But what we can't possibly objectively grasp is the very next moment. In other words, what it means for a now to be incorporated into a continuity. And that's just the beginning of it.
Well, she calls it discontinuous.
But then why does she talk about time being discontinuous?
Yeah, because I think she calls it discontinuous because actuality exists only for a fleeting moment.
But that's not really true.
Well,
I
that's
think,
what you
I
say.
think,
I
I
don't
think
think
that's what I
she
mean
said.
by paradox. I really think there's an insurmountable paradox, because
Yeah,
on the
I'm not
one
sure she
hand, the
believes it.
now contains everything and time flows through the now and in the now. But on the other hand, time does really consist of distinguishable moments that can be arranged in order.
Mm. See,
And
I go back to an earlier chapter.
I
Okay,
just
let me
want to
go
say
ahead.
one last thing, which is
Go
now
ahead.
can mean two completely different things.
Yeah, I
Now
bet.
can mean that which we are always in,
Yeah.
or it can mean a moment in time that we can observe flow back into the past.
Mm.
And those, even though they seem to have to be identified, they're irreconcilable. And I think that's why this talk about quantization comes in. And another aspect of it is, how about, we can talk about the flow of time, but can we talk about, we can talk about the flow of time in the sense of a series of moments falling back into the past. And that's an objective flow. But what about the very flow of a moment from being present to being immediately past? And that's what Husserl means by the constitution of time. The flow from a protension to an actual now to becoming a retention.
Mm-hmm.
I'm observing something.
That does not take time. The time itself does not take time to flow. And so there's a level of time constitution, which is in a sense is flowing, but is a flow in a completely different sense from the sense that an event flows through time. And I'm not doing very good at explaining this right now. But the thing is, when you start to get into this, it just becomes incredibly paradoxical and difficult to account for. And I don't think Conrad-Martius, and I think that's part of what she's getting into when she talks about the quantized now, but I don't see her really grappling with this enough, although
if you open Die
very
Zeit,
subtle.
if you open her 1954 book, you will see that the table of contents has it so that the first whole section is organized according to going through these paradoxes with Aristotle, the Aristotelian paradoxes, and the Kantian paradoxes. And so that's exactly where she's coming from. But it's also important to note that for Aristotle, the definition of time, which appears in what is it, physics book, well, anyway, the definition of time in physics book 4, section 10 through 14, that's the Physical Lectures on Time. That's the translation of it, of the title. There, time is described as the spanned interval between the nows two. So there are two nows in the very definition, the dihorismos, the horizoning of this disclosure space of the now. So I'm employing Peter Manchester's perspective on this, and this spanned interval of the now is necessary. There has to be a continuity here. It can't just be an instantaneous crossing point of, you know, an absolute past and an absolute future. Otherwise, there would be no continuity between these points in the series of nows that as we think of them. There has to be a constitutional twofold of nows. So there is actually
But then what does he mean by spanned interval of nows? That's the paradox.
Well, for
Because on
example,
the one hand, we certainly can understand time in terms of moments, but between any two moments, there are always more moments. And
yeah,
it's a
and to
continuum.
understand,
Right.
like a note in a melody is meaningless, you know, without the continuity of the melody. We have to employ
Right.
retention and protension. You know, so in fact, there are two diagrams, is the way Peter Manchester explains it, and this is what is called the figure of double continuity. So I mean, it sounds like it's making it more complicated, but this is what we need to do in order to have an account and a definition of time.
But can there be one? That's really my question. My hunch is that we simply cannot get past the paradox of time is definitely includes nows, but time is also continuous. My hunch is that's a final barrier that we can't possibly ever think past.
So
But
one thing-
I'll
now,
have to read this next.
can
but
you hear
would
me?
he deny that?
Sorry, I can't
Maybe
quite
he would
tell.
deny that.
Yeah, we can hear you, Evan.
Okay, sorry. Just one thing that I'm noticing as we talk about this paradox is one thing that I think we pick up from Husserl is going to a higher order of understanding. And I'm just analyzing the linguistics around here. And we have three distinct metaphors playing on in the back of our minds when we're talking about time. We talk about a series, so a category defined by a common species. So you can identify in some intuitive level that there is something called now and past now, and those are identified as having a common essence, origin of some kind. And then we have flow. And when we talk about flow, I think really when you press into that metaphor, you're deriving an indistinguishable mode of understanding time. You cannot isolate a moment in a flow. I mean, that's the Heraclitan argument, right? You can't step in a river twice. You can bring that into whatever you want. And then we have this conception of a constitution. So it seems to me like what we're saying by constitution is trying to systemize together two very, very different conceptual frameworks for understanding time. I don't know how that helps our conversation, but it helps us understand better how our minds are experiencing the phenomena of time. So I don't know about the paradox, but I know that we should be very clear and not mix our metaphors, because that would.
Yeah.
Well, I think what I'm saying is the paradox lies precisely as we absolutely can escape neither one. The both are absolutely necessarily inescapable and unified, and we cannot understand how that can be, but we do know that they're inseparable.
There's something
That's
there.
what I want to say.
Oh, it's marvelous, because that brings us up to, there's something about the many and the one here, isn't there? There's something about a unity of elements, sort of a trinity.
Yeah.
There is something of the mysterion
Exactly.
in this understanding of presence.
Yes.
Exactly. And so that would be something people might shoot for. Maybe in some sense, we at least have an inkling that we can't really grasp that somehow these are reconciled. And in a way, we certainly do have experienced their reconciliation because we do experience time.
Yeah, and if you look at this temporal passing as being exactly as Evan described, I think Evan had a lot of clarity in laying it out. You know, that say the one order is the ordinal series, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on a number line. You know, and then there has to be another way of looking at this so that they're not just radically discontinuous, but you have another dimension of line. You know, if it's just point after point, there's no memory, there's no novum, right? It's just a presentation of a point constantly, you know, maybe in sequence, but that would be meaningless unless you have a higher order, you know, looking at it like it's constituting a line. And the idea of constitution in forms in space-time, either in space or in time, however you want to look at it, is going to require this distinction of levels. And that means a higher order, you know, or a lower order even. You know, it could be that the primordial datum also requires there to be the lower level distinction of the givenness of that datum, the presence of it and its absence, which is like a kind of lower level, you know, grasping of like not having the thing.
Can I ask something here that is interesting? And this might be a rabbit hole, so forgive me, but it seems that another component that's playing in this text, but also as we broaden it out to our perception of time, is the way in which religious experience itself alters our structured perception of time. That seems interesting to me. You know, we dive into the Eucharist there, and I mean, I'm not a Baptist, so I can't speak for Conrad-Martius' experience of religion. But it seems to me that one of the interesting things about the Eucharist is that you are enacting the memory of an act of suffering, both real and symbolic, and that becomes a presence. So it's not only your individual perception of time that's going on there, it's also a layer of symbolic reality time and communal experience time. You're entering into an entirely new space. That's at least what theologians would argue, is that the liturgy invites one into new time, into different time, into the presence of God.
Okay, you're very close to what I've been trying to push on Jim. And it's related to ritual, and it's related to an absolute past. I have spent, I can't tell you how many, I don't know, I say hours, but certainly many minutes this past couple of weeks trying to get a whole handle on the idea of past. And it's the most confusing and mysterious thing that I've ever encountered, because the past feels solid and yet intangible. It's mysterious. And so I keep asking myself, where does the past go, since it's so solid? And I've tried to see it, and it's just completely confusing. It really makes my head spin. But the thing I wanted to be suggesting to Jim with this notion, this dual time that Conrad-Martius has introduced, is that the past is always real. I can't call it actual because he defines the now as only actual. But I want to say the past remains real. And therefore the question is, we as mortals cannot contact the past. But isn't there reason to believe that it's possible that the past is actual and it can, in some sphere, be accessed? And that's what I think the Eucharist may be suggesting.
And I think that's also another reason why many thinkers, including William James and Husserl and probably Conrad-Martius and Louis Lavelle, talk about presence and the present as that which contains time. And that in a way is trying to respond, I think, to the very intuition you're describing, that we tend to think of time as constantly slipping away. And yet at the same time, the past feels completely solid. And we know things about it, like you can't undo what you have done, for example. How is that so that we know you can't undo what you have done?
I don't know.
But it is.
I know, so it's mysterious.
And that's why there's more than one way of thinking or understanding or even experiencing of the present. That's why a lot of thinkers say presence is not just this knife edge of whatever happens to be happening right now, but there's a wider sense of presence in which time, which contains the whole of time.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
And that in some sense, we actually do live within that or participate in that. that what it means for us to even be conscious beings in time is that we participate in that very presence which contains time, not the present contained within time. And that's very mysterious. But I think it's, again, I don't think that's just making things up, because it's responding to facts, like the past feels present. If there were no past, there would be no present. Imagine a completely pastless present. That's literally nothing. And yet, everything is within the present. But for the present to have any substance, it also has to contain the past. And yet the present also must add to the past, or it wouldn't be the present either. And all these things come together. And what we end up with is that it's certainly wrong to think about the present merely as the knife edge of what literally is actual right now. That, I think we know that we have to exclude that. We know that is wrong. And what drives me crazy is we know there must be more, but as soon as you start talking about stuff like this presence, which is absolute and the same all time for everyone, and then we're part of it, I don't know. I can't say I'm sure. I mean, that sounds hard to believe. So I don't know. So it's sort of like there's this dilemma between, we know the present can't be a mere knife edge, and yet it's really hard to grasp or understand or accept that somehow there is an eternal present that we actually in some sense participate in, and that's what it even means for us to exist at all.
Well, maybe experience is drawn between the poles of this instant, this point-like instant of just the immediate now, you know, that can be objectified in an important sense, in the sense that it can be looked at in the third person as a series of nows, like, or if we reduce a film to snapshots, you know, that's one pole. And the other pole would be the full now that includes all time, now as in all eternity. And that's not usually what we mean by now, but, you know, we don't mean always the instant. Sometimes we mean this hour or this minute or this few nanoseconds, you know, or a few seconds, or maybe this day, this year. Sometimes that's what we mean by now. Just like when we say here, we don't mean an infinitesimal point, but we mean like this room, or, you know, this epoch, or this world that we live in, you know, or here, this country, if we're talking about countries, you know. So these are indexicals, like the I, you know, and the you, you know, these refer to things through indication, which is different than through expression. So there's like the indexical meaning of the now as the instant. Wait, is that the indexical? I don't know. Anyway, the point is, you know, there's this distinction between an instantaneous moment that can be objectified and the more, maybe it's more subjective, but more rich and real fullness of the now. And sometimes in this kind of literature, there's this like this big now, like the all at once now of, like, for instance, the now all around the world, this instant, but all around the world for everyone, you know, or all through creation, all the cosmos now. That could be distinguished, like, objectively, third person, scientifically, from the next instant of all the creation, you know. But you know, but in a sense that is kind of like the knife edge. And so it's just a matter of, is everything beyond the knife edge nothing? Does it just go into nothingness, or does it come out of eternity and go back into another part of eternity? You know, and I think that's the kind of perspective that you find in the 1950 D Site, whereas her essay in 1927, D Site, which came out, by the way, in the same Jahrbuch as Heidegger's Being and Time, you know, it uses this image of the knife edge, and it uses this term das Nichts, you know, and she might be using it in a more, like, she was very influenced by Jakob Boehme and von Bader. Sorry?
You can get the site for 40,000 euros. Oh no, for 4,000. What is that? 4,000 euros? I'm trying to figure out.
We can circulate a PDF.
Okay, that would be nice.
Yeah.
So you can't afford it, I can guarantee it.
Yeah, it's nice to see how these ideas come about, and how they're different in 1927 than in 1954. Some of it is really the same, but the Aeonic World-Periphery, this is a totally new category. And you can see in the table of contents in, I know the 1954, I don't know about the 27, I can't remember if it's very Aristotelian, Kantian, but it starts with all these antinomies, and it does go into the whole structure of the now in Aristotle being, between these two nows in the physics, and that the now, time, is an image of eternity, what that means. This is covered in some of the pages on the phenomenology of number, because the numbers of time are relevant in the context of Aristotle. So yeah, so I mean, well, can we go back to what Bill was saying about passing time early on? Bill, I think you identified passing time or real time or whatever it's called with the transcendental imaginative side of things.
Yeah, I think that's right. What do you think?
I always thought of it a little bit differently, but I guess, I mean, that's certainly an important, see, well, here's the thing, like on page 73, there's this paragraph that starts, the transcendental imaginative time has a twofold motion. So already in the transcendental imaginative time, there's a twofold. The antinomies of which bring us to the heart of the real ontological understanding of time. So, I don't know, I think we have to like really go back to passing time.
The point is, I'm sure Jim says this many times, is that the transcendental imaginative time, it has to be continuous. So this is the imaginative part, that it's continuous. And so I understood the discontinued continuity, and we can talk about that. Jim's not here. I always thought it had to do with discontinuities between the potentialities and the actualities. That's the discontinuity.
Yeah. I think that's true at the level when there are these potentialities that are actualizing various things, in the creation or in between the finished cosmos in this transnatural realm. But then there's also this like really primordial sense of continuity and discontinuity that I think is more like what Evan was saying about how this is kind of like the problem of the one and the many, manifest in the form of these paradoxes of time. But we could also go another transcendental aesthetic direction and see paradoxes of space and object as also expressing the same underlying thing. And that's this ontological dynamism that is the problematic of continuity and discontinuity, and what she's offering is a continuous discontinuity in a certain sense. So there's like
to this, I'm not sure exactly what's going on either, but I take, when she talks about the quantized moments or discontinuous time, what kind of makes sense to me, maybe she's saying, is that's the now that includes everything.
Everything? What do you mean everything?
The now within which time is discontinuous. Because in a sense, it is always new. We're always in it, and a new moment is always here. And yet it's not something that we can place within the flow of time. We can't, it's kind of hard. It's so paradoxical, because you can always look back and say, well, yesterday at noon, I was in time and time was flowing for me. What was that? And so, how should I put it? We know that time is always flowing, and we always have the experience of the flowing of time and the arising of time itself and the arising of a new moment in itself. And yet this experience of the very flowing of time and the very arising of each moment is not something that we can really look back and place in the flow of time. And so the very experience of the very arising of a new moment and the very flowing of time into the past is not something that itself is in time. And that's what's discontinuous.
This is what Jim says in reply to some emails.
I think he would say this is yes. And I think I'm not speaking authoritatively here, but at all, but I think what I've been able to figure out is that the Aeonic World-Periphery is related to this, I think.
Yeah.
Because for Husserl, first of all, the question is, what does it mean for time to even flow and for us to experience that? It is the sort of moving of time from a protension to the given now to a retention. And then the retentions are retained, and then et cetera. So what is this very flowing? What is this very moving from protension to actual to retention? That flowing is not itself something that takes time. It's not a duration. It doesn't take time for time to flow. So the very flowing of time is not an event in time. And so there's, in a sense, there's a parallel flow to the flow of time in the sense that an event takes time. So an event taking time is one sense of the flowing of time, but the other sense is the very flowing of time. And the very flowing of time does not take time. And so we can't place it in the flow of time. And that, I think, is what probably is something along the lines of what Conrad-Martius is talking about when she says that the now is discontinuous. But then, if we think, here's where I think I can connect it, which is if we have this idea that as a thing or as a person or any being exists in time and either acts or changes, it always acts and changes according to its essence. You know, I do not act and change according to the essence of a turtle. I act and change according to the essence of a human being. And as a conscious being who acts, I do not merely obey my essence, but I consciously can anticipate and even create alternatives to pursue. In other words, I can choose and I can act. But as the kind of being I am presented with a certain kind of alternatives to choose from. So if we think about, but then we could look at a physical object, you know, like a physical object falling. It obeys certain rules, namely the laws of motion, according to its essence. So what's going on here? We have a rock falling that's obeying the laws of motion, Newton's laws of motion. How do those laws of motion get into and shape the change that occurs? Or a living being, how does my body continue to develop according to the essence of human body? Or how do I, as a conscious being who can choose, how am I able to envisage and how are alternatives available to me such that I can realize them for myself? How is all that happening? How are these potentials and these essences flowing into the present of any being? And so that must be something very much along the lines of the future itself flowing into the present. And so that flow of the future into the present and concretely means the flow of my essence into the present. So those essences are outside of time, and their relationship to what happens in time is not itself something that happens in time, because they constitute the very temporal being, and what the being is as it moves forward in time. Now, I have a terrible feeling I've just lost everyone, but that's kind of, but it
No,
has to
that's the very difficulty, right? Because we're trying to talk about ourselves, and we have, in order to do that, we have to reach out somehow. Can I read something? I think that this is beginning at the beginning of something else. I think this is helpful to understand the problematic. Beginning with Aristotle, philosophers have regularly attempted to correct familiar ways of speaking that construe time itself as a motion, a passing, for example, or more canonically, a flowing. They have just as regularly failed. Because it is sustained by the ancient comparison to a river, the notion that time flows is past rooting out, and yet it remains a difficulty, even a doubtful observation. Time cannot itself be a motion, Aristotle explains, since motions are faster and slower are discriminated with respect to time. Time is not a motion, he concludes, but at best something about motion. That's from Physics 4:10, 218b, 10 through 11. And then Plotinus rejects even an indirect connection to physical motion. To make time a feature of motion or something defined in relation to it, for example, the measure of motion, turns time into a redundant accompaniment, a motion running alongside of every motion. Still, a Platonist like Plotinus must confront the systematically decisive text in Timaeus, according to which time is a moving image of eternity. That's Timaeus 37d. But Iamblichus, the 4th century Neoplatonist, for whose interpretation of Plotinus we are preparing in this chapter, stipulates that the moving of time is neither like nor among sensible motions, since it is motion with respect to eternity alone. So there's a few little phrases in here.
interesting.
Something, it's not a motion, but something about motion. And then this, it ends with this, well, and it has the image of eternity, and then with respect to eternity alone.
And who
I think
says
these are
that?
really,
Who
well,
says that?
those, so respectively, that's Aristotle, and then Timaeus, Plato, and then finally Iamblichus.
He says time is motion in respect to eternity alone, the Iamblichus.
Right, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, Sally.
I really appreciate what you just read, but I'm on such thin ice here. But I mean, I thought it was Einstein, right, that said that no time exists because of motion, or at least motion between two objects or something like that, right?
Yeah, relativity, right?
I mean, right? That's
Yeah, and what that's supposed to throw out is this idea of the absolute, flow, the absolute time, that is in Newton, that time it moves equably, and this equability of time is not about the motion, but it's something about the motion that it moves equally, equabilitas flux or something like that. And what is this moving equitably? Well, for Newton, it's objective, third person, empirical science way of handling the problem, the paradox of time's flowing. So
I'm gonna have
Einstein,
to,
yeah.
I'm gonna have to read something that Jim sent me in an email that addresses exactly what you guys are talking about. He says, for Conrad-Martius, the Ionic world is a unique kind of non-flowing passing time. And it is this which gives forth the being quanta that Jeremy keeps referring to, of momentariness of each object. Her thought experiment of thinking of an absolutely unmoving, unchanging object has for her the effect in the experience of this unchanging object still being pervaded by now moments. And I found the page where Jim actually refers to this thought experiment. It wasn't easy to find, but I found it. But the idea is to imagine, as a thought experiment, Gedanken experiment, thinking about an object that's not moving. It doesn't move at all. There's no movement. Any movement you can imagine is subtracted from it. And yet there's still this kind of movement. There's still a kind of time in it, which is a motionless kind of time. And that's this non-flowing passing time.
Yeah, Yeah, that's really
Oh,
cool.
but that certainly shows that time passes without motion, that motion or change does not depend, that time does not depend on motion or change.
Right.
And it certainly shows that.
But this is the time that I think is this I can't use the word transcendental because you use the Ionic time.
Another way of looking at it is that this is like a change in the order of observation, the ordinality change that Evan mentioned. Because this is how Husserl, this is the kind of, I think, the framework that Husserl uses. But if you look at like a series, you need to have like another dimension or another order of observation on that thing. And that would be like that something about motion, not the motion or not the whatever it is, the lines on the page, but stepping back and taking a look. And you can kind of think of that as like the function of the mind, or at least that which comprehends, as the Aeonic World-Periphery is there as this comprehensive entity. I mean, even in just its like diagrammatic comprehension of what's happening in the whatever designates the world or the now, that's like another the point is it's a higher dimension, right? It's supposed to be like, if this is a two-dimensional slice or a world disk, then this tube or whatever that it's flowing on is three-dimensional. Or if our experience is like this, whatever dimensionality this is, 3 + 1 or whatever, the next dimension up or some kind of higher order, or maybe even lower order somehow, would help us understand what that thing is. It would have to be a higher order, I think. It would have to be a higher order, that comprehends it, which you can't see. You can't see your mind. You can see your eye, you can see your face, but the things that happen in relation to bodies, that has to be seen stepping back in this interiority. So we need that interiority, or this deeper level than the things that are happening on the world stage. There needs to be like a backstage place where things can be comprehended, and that's where I think we can memory. We can do we can have memory. We can remember the past, pretend, anticipate future, and imagination. We can adumbrate the object. We can like imagine what it would be like if we ran around the other side of the thing and saw it from there. So functions of memory and imagination are part of our interiority, and by stepping back, by using that hyletic or retroscendent function, we're able to be in that something about motion, or able to see time in relation to eternity, in reference to some kind of deeper equability, not the Newtonian equability, but a different kind of, absolute reference point for the things that are relative among objects.
Or maybe another way of looking at it, like all that is involved with, suppose for a period of time, you're observing something and nothing is changing, like something just sitting there and there's no change. And yet, in a sense, something is happening. Nothing is happening in the obvious sense, but something is happening. Time is flowing. But what is that? So I think the good thing about that Gedanken experiment is it says what kind of isolates the one quote unquote thing which is happening, which is only the flow of time. But then the flow of time can't really be considered to be an event. How long does it take for time to flow? That almost doesn't even make sense, because when you ask how long does something take, that's assuming the flowing of time. And so things take time in the flow of time. And so the very flow of time is not an event in time. It's not something that's happening in time.
It's atemporal. It's atemporal.
Right, exactly. The very flow of time is somehow atemporal.
And might I suggest it's possible that there's not just two levels, but in fact, the very two-dimensionality here is kind of metaphorical, And any kind of dimensionality you're dealing with, whether it's a line, the one-dimensional thing, or going through a tunnel is kind of like a one-dimensional event, or this world, exists. You can kind of think of it as along one dimension, but you can always have this other vertical relation, this other, transcendent to the immanent series, whatever that dimensionality is. There's always another dimension. So in a sense, it's not just that there are two levels, one that we can see, the sensible, and the noetic being something, that we see through or whatever, something about the stuff that grasps it, but rather a kind of proliferation of dimensionality and infinite interiority. You can call it interiority, or you could just as well call it exteriority, but in a super ecstatic sense. And I think that's exactly where Conrad-Martius is going with framing everything that happens, be it passing time, object in space, or biology, the phenomena of whatever she's dealing with, as being strewn out between these ultimate, instatic sinking dynamisms on the one side, and the ultimate ecstatic transcendent transcendence on the other side. That's really situating stuff in the infinite sphere between like a center that is just as recessive or sunken as the periphery that is just as ecstatic, and that gives you a kind of absolute reference frame.
But here's the thing that drives me crazy, which is, and I think it's true, the flow of time is atemporal. However, let's see, time is flowing now. Time is flowing now. You see what I'm saying? I can say, well, the flow of time is intemporal, but I think of any sort of moment in time, and it somehow also makes sense to say, at that moment, time is flowing. So the paradox, the question, pardon me while I bang my head against the wall, but the paradox in question is, how can that be? That in some sense, it seems time must be atemporal, and yet in another sense that you can always say that time is flowing now, and time was flowing 1 minute ago when I was experiencing it. Maybe I don't know what to make of that, but I think that's the paradox.
The two sides of this antinomy, are not equal. One is, kind of like the objective point, way of marking time, and the other one is something that can include that one. Like this one cannot grasp that one, but but this one grasps this one. So you can superimpose this passing time. You can superimpose the finite on the infinite, but you can't represent the infinite in the finite. So there's a hierarchical relation between this ultimate continuity of the infinite, which is continuity beyond continuity. It's beyond the representation of any other finite, fragmenta, disjecta, membra, or whatever Jim said in the book. But on the other side is, and we're free in between them. We're free to adopt the suppositions of the infinite or of the finite. And I think that positivism is all about adopting the suppositions of the finite, because that's what we can tie evidences in a certain respect to. But the other side, there is a way of tying evidence to that as well, but that requires this spiritual attitude, and that's the transcendent side of everything from Kant to Husserl. There's all this transcendent side, and I think you especially see it in the Husserlian inner time consciousness. There's like everything is spanning these two dimensions, of that which is the markable time. This is point A, the Anfang now, and then time flows and it's over here and then it's over here. But then there's this other dimension in which the vectorial nature of this stuff comes alive, and that's subjective, that's transcendent and subjective. So that's the kind of stuff that the natural scientific attitude wants to get rid of and turn everything into like third person objective time. All the markers, it's just a bunch of markers, and we like kind of just impose a time framework that works. and maybe it gets weird near a black hole in a very specific way, but otherwise it's like this. That's very third person objective. Whereas that other one is very subjective. It's about this interiority and transcendence.
And so this is the huge question, which is totally at the heart of any question about religious experience, is in what sense, well, we can talk about presuppositions or assumptions, but I think it's more than that. In what sense do we really contact, or do we really have experience of, or do we really in our being participate in that atemporal being of time? And so I think we do somehow, but that's a very difficult question.
Yeah, well, like in the Eucharist, that's one thing, that's one place where you're doing that, but it might be all pervasive too. Just like we might think of it like as something that's done on Sundays, or something in our more religious moments. We have that transcendence in our life, whether as eternity in time or as the infinite in the finite. But it's kind of like, we're kind of like in Freud's time. He had to write the psychopathology of everyday life for people to realize that there's pathological phenomena everywhere. In fact, non-pathological phenomena is this myth. It doesn't even really happen because it's always transforming. And similarly, I think the finite is a kind of myth that we live by, that becomes our opinion. And the sense world, what is that? It would be a booming, bustling confusion if we didn't have some aspect to give it the melody that it fits into, the harmony of the spheres. So I think that we need the world happening inside of that harmony.
Yeah, and I think this may be what you're saying. This isn't, if this is really what time is all about, that some kind of contact with eternity is not some special experience, but what it even means to exist at all.
Right. Yeah. And so for Conrad-Martius, there's this weird thing called the founding ontological dynamism. And it's really like a deeply mystical, but also transphysical point that that bears out in her philosophy of time, as well as all these other areas in her work. It's kind of the linchpin of it all. There's this Urbewegung, So I mean, anyway, that's her like key concept, but I think it's really like a fundamental mystical motif. Okay,
So,
I mean, what it is brings us off point a bit, maybe.
So what Jim says, and Stein says the same thing, is that the temporal are atoms of the eternal. And I question that word atoms. I'm not sure he means that. But in any case, the temporal is parasitic, if you like, derives from the eternal. Now, I claim that that's not a mystical experience. I can do it. I do it all the time. In fact, I can easily see that. And I find that trivial. So I don't know if that's trivial for other people, but it's trivial for me. And the way I do this easily is by trying to realize that before I get somewhere in time, it's already there. And so there's always this sense this is a phenomenological sense, in my passing through time, that I am arriving at a time that's already there. And so that's easy for me to see. I assume other people can see that. And so I can find it either phenomenologically easy to imagine that that time is essentially feeding on, the eternal is feeding, the time is boiling up for the eternal. That seems easy for me to see. I don't think that takes a lot of effort to see that.
William Burroughs has a famous line, death needs time for what it kills to grow in.
I'll write that down.
It's dark. But we're in this dark dimension, as Conrad-Martius says. But maybe that darkness is really just our spiritual darkness. We don't have that spiritual attitude, and we're blind to the effulgence of light all around us. Yes, Ellie.
Okay, so doesn't this, like what you've just said, define a mystic? A mystic doesn't have the anxiety and the apprehension about existence and time and all this stuff, because they're already sort of living on the other side, which I've been thinking about since we've been talking over the last hour or so. And I'm just thinking, I'm wondering if the source of this anxiety, although then I catch myself because it's oh no, this precedes Christianity, which is, we have just this this anxiety, or whatever you want to call it, about our perception of time and the past and the future. And yet somehow we know that there's another reality, or is there another reality, which we can't comprehend, because it's out of our reach, because we're physical. So
yeah, I mean, we all get what a mystic might be, even if we're wrong according to definitions or whatever. But so when we do that, we just kind of we become a mystic in our thought experiment for a moment. That's an aspect of ourselves. That's something that we can all do. We can hear, when Sally's describing what a mystic is going through, we can be yeah, that's, I can think that, that's maybe not where I want to situate my ego when I present myself to my students, because I think that they want science or whatever in their philosophy class. But actually in Randy's philosophy classes, by the way, I situate myself in the recognition of the transcendent or whatever, because, we start with lots of Eastern philosophy, and you have to understand what these terms mean, the Atman, Brahman, and all that, and it's cool to sit there in that situation, and it gets the students there too, and then we're all kind of being mystical, and now you can fall out of it. Many of them will fall asleep. This is at 8 a.m. Or after class, I'm oh, I just got to get this tie off and get out of here. I'm suffering. I'm not a mystic in those moments, and I need to take a nap because I got up too early or whatever, but we can get into this transcendent mode, the spiritual attitude, and we can also be a part of the natural world. And I think having that balance in our daily practice, whether that means if you're an Orthodox Christian or whatever, Conrad-Martius, or in a different way Edith Stein or something, your rituals. But I mean, just having that attitude does give you a solution to the anxiety. Yeah.
As the phenomenologist would say, all you have to do is bracket yourself, and now you're in mystic land. Okay. I mean, this is what the Hesychasts professor, which was one of the big sticking points on the debate between the Easterners and the Westerners, which was, you all, meaning Westerners, you're overthinking this. Just suspend everything and let, God, whatever you want to call it, come to you.
Right.
Okay, so anyway.
Yeah, and I think that unfortunately there are two sides. There's a debate with that. There's some conflict, because many phenomenologists would be oh wait, that's a precept. You're bringing in loads and loads of baggage when you say that. You can't say that. But then again, there's a lot of figures, we already mentioned, Gershwantner. There's a lot of, in Sokolowski, there's a lot of more phenomenology of religion type stuff out there that understand that it's actually another version of presuppositionlessness that is being striven for, being even invoked and achieved performatively, genetically, and the idea of the Urbewegung, this primordial motion, that's also a ritual reenactment in the imagination. When when you say the word, the logos, this word is also a ritual reenactment of the arche and telos, and even just imagining these far out categories, or even just imagining transcendence of time as eternity, as being something like this, you identify with it, this higher function of your self, the ahamkara or whatever, takes that form, and that becomes your reality. And if you understand that these are real ontological categories, categories of ultimate reality that are also part of a continuum, that real concrete experience, the real reality, is situated inside of, then you're actually invoking them, and you're manifesting these spiritual realities. The ultimate reality of the Apeirische Raumzeit Einheit, this infinite space-time, because it's all around us. Whatever dimensionality you're in, the infinite or numberless dimension, is going to be there. And similarly with time, eternity is there supporting it on all sides so that it can exist. I mean, that's my view of what she's saying. But, I just find in this idea of like the Urbewegung, this founding ontological dynamism, the basis for a kind of process philosophy that's expressed here, that's also very concrete and real and realistic.
I wanted to, speaking, referring to what Sally was just talking about, so I want to share with you some, I guess you can call them practices, but I've been experimenting with phenomenological experience of having time, and particularly how much time we have. I mean, we say this commonly, and so what I notice is that the secular world, you always feel like you don't have enough time. There's always this kind of rush. And
what's called late capitalism.
I think that's probably right. And but then there's also this thing, and you can actually switch this on, is to now sort of stop, which is already a temporal thing, right? Is that then regard yourself as having all the time in the world. And it completely changes your attitude about things when you think about yourself as having an infinite amount of time. And so, I mean, and these are experiences, of phenomenological experiences, which are not distant from us. They don't have to be religious, but they're available to all of us.
Yeah, right on. This should be your book of attitude changing phenomenological thought experiments.
Yeah, well, they're thought experiments that actually have an effect, though. They're not just they're not OTOIS, however you pronounce that word, OCOs.
May I, if it's all right, continue reading a little bit of this excerpt I read before? It continues on in an interesting way, just for a moment. If in some way it makes sense to say that time flows, then it ought to be possible to say which way it flows. Does it flow from the past, welling up in the present and spilling out into the future, or from the future, looming nearer and nearer and then coming to pass? We should speak of it in both ways. Beneath this antinomy, another confusion lurks. Is it time itself that flows, or events that flow through time? Are we, the observers, being carried along by the stream, or are we on the bank watching it flow by, or maybe both? This is the beginning. This is the first chapter, the first, the setting up chapter of the syntax of time. And the title comes from Anaximander, which Conrad-Martius is bringing up as well. Hart brings it up in our reading. I think that having read Peter Manchester's book, which is all about bringing the Aristotelian and Neoplatonic and pre-Socratic context of what time is in relation to eternity into the discussion of Husserl, which is about what time is with these two dimensions and as a double continuity. I think it really helped me understand like where Conrad-Martius is coming from with these categories of time and eternity. And like Evan disappeared, but I was going to recommend also this book, which is also Peter Manchester, Temporality and Trinity. This is his, so this other one, Syntax of Time, is his like Aristotle and Husserl book. And this one is an Augustine and Heidegger book. And so this one is about the double continuity and the twofold nature of time in Aristotle and in Husserl. And so there's a kind of like twofold schematic in there. And then this one, Temporality and Trinity, is all about the threefold. At one point, he calls this the twofold syntax of time and this the threefold syntax of time. He says there's two syntaxes of time, in fact. So anyway, I mean, it might be really interesting to have a look. I think I'll like send these around to the group since we're getting into the last chapters of Hart's book. I think it's an important candidate to consider, you know, what we might read next. I mean, so my opinions are maybe this book, and then we have a little bit of the translation of Rodney, one of our members, has made a translation of the beginning of Gerda Walther's book, Phenomenology of Mysticism. I think that would be another really good one to accompany our contemplative meditations on Hedwig Conrad-Martius's thought. But I think that this one is also really good for all of the stuff we're thinking about with time. So this book ends by, it's kind of talking about the Eucharist all throughout, but it really ends with getting really into the original sources, the texts themselves, what they say in Greek, how the words that are brought up, like the breaking of the bread, the word is klassis, breaking. You know, how this compares to what's happening in Architas, the Pythagorean, and the place that the word breaking has in Plotinus and in Architas. So they're very similar in that he's bringing contemporary definitions of time in Husserl and Heidegger back through their sources. So Husserl has as its most ancient precedent the twofold definition of time in Aristotle, according to Manchester, especially if you look at Aristotle as contextualized with like Plotinus, and this one seeing in Heidegger's thinking about the threefold nature of time, what Augustine has to say. And there's some other authors recently who have brought those figures together. So anyway.
You know, when you were reading that passage, that was from the syntax of time about
chapter 1.
Time flow, which direction does it flow? You know, I've gotten started, you know, die Zeit, der Raum, and what's the third one?
Das Sein.
I've started them all. And you know what? There's some pages in die Zeit that sound exactly like that. You probably remember that.
What's really interesting is if you open die Zeit, the first page has the footnote is like to Aristotle's Physics, book 4, this very section, like this is where the definition of time is. And then the next page or 2 pages later, the next footnote, footnote 2, is Plotinus in the section on time and eternity. That's exactly how Peter is proceeding. So there's actually
he doesn't know Conrad-Martius.
I don't think so. I never asked him. I never found her work among his stuff. I found some similar, you know, he read German. He, you know, he's familiar with all the literature on time and temporality. So I wouldn't be surprised, but I haven't found any like real hardcore evidence. But he was my teacher. He passed away in 2015. And he was like a real mystic, as well as a voyager, a traveler, as the 60s people are called, right? He was experienced in the Jimi Hendrix sort of sense, but he was also a president of the International.
Are you using euphemisms there?
Yes.
Okay.
And this is known to the other presidents of the International Society for Neoplatonic Studies, of which he was a founding member. Well, he was an important member, and he was a founding member of the AAS group on Neoplatonism that like broke off and became another Neoplatonism group, I believe.
Does this mean we have to take drugs to understand this?
Well, it means we have to have the attitude, you know, in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, he in the early on, he says, you know, you could use these things. Tantric yoga certainly is all about these shortcuts, you know, but even when you're on drugs, it's not going to do you any good if you don't have the spiritual attitude. That's the phrase that that Hart uses in chapter 1 when he's explaining her general methodology. You know, we got to open our hearts, you know, to these transcendent categories. Because even if you could do all the drugs in the world at the same time And if you're just thinking right here, it's not going to do you any good. You're just going to fry your brain. You know, or you know, you need to do practice, have these rituals, you know, do Bill's, you know, meditations on, you know, how to have a good attitude. What was it? By considering that you have infinite time in a certain respect.
Yeah.
You know, you know, you got to do these meditations, these practices, these rituals, but you know, their phenomenological and real ontological import has to do with you know, actually really taking the step and really you know, staking it out and going to the other side and accepting that that is reality, you know, and standing in the bigger spiritual earth, in the total cosmos.
He was at Stony Brook, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at this book, and this is even more more expensive than Deep Sight.
Yeah. Well, I'll send out a PDF, and then we can forward it to our local print place, and they'll yeah.
Well, you know, I've been looking for those 3 books by Conrad-Martius in German. And my experience is a lot of times there are some copies that are outrageous, but if you keep looking, sooner or later, more reasonable ones tend to pop up.
Well,
So I was able to get the 3 for less than $30 or $40 each, I think.
There's a website called Bookfinder. I think it's, I don't know if it's maybe .com, and that'll search like, you know, Abe books and what are they all called, like Alibris, you know, Amazon, in different countries, and it'll break down, it'll show you like, I recommend this Bookfinder. I put it in the chat. That's how I acquired a lot of the original Conrad-Martius texts that I have. So I totally recommend that. But also, like, ask me, I have a PDF of basically every book in the world. And I also use clairvoyance for the ones that aren't in the world.
That helps.
Yeah. Well, so now it is 3 o'clock. We've had our 2 hours of, I think we did a decent job, actually, even though we did invoke the text a few times. But, you know, I think the point of these reading groups is to wrestle with the topics, you know, with the attitudes, with the thematic objects, which are sometimes best expressed when we look at the text and refer to specific concepts. But we also have to deal with what's generally being presented to us. You know, I think there's a lot of really cool terms that we didn't get to meditate on long enough, like a pneumatic physics. You know, this idea that that her philosophy has these categories of mass, matter, substance, you know, real natural phenomena, and in the real scientific context of physics, of like basic physics, you know, in this really broad picture of the cosmos. And so it does allow for these categories of you know, this world that we experience having like a luminous dimension, or a possible integrality, or maybe even like an integrality that's already there in a way, but we're not able to really see it and experience it and position ourselves in that and have that attitude. You know, we are affected by all of you know, all the terrible things, all the uncomfortable things, the frustrating things in life. But maybe if we didn't, maybe it wouldn't be all that different from how it is now, except it would just be a happier place. You know, not, well, you know, and then that could lead to other problems, right? We could be like happy slaves to Jeff Bezos or whatever, Bezos, you know. But anyway, I think we did a decent job. What do you think? Is there anything else that we wanted to cover?
Really, really helpful today.
Yeah, thank you, Sally. I have all the text from our chat as well. I can circulate the references that we stuck in there.
So are we going to go to the next chapter next time?
yeah, I guess, keep on moving. I mean, we didn't have Jim here for this this section, so maybe that would be the way to go. I don't know. Maybe we need to contemplate it a bit more. Next chapter, chapter 6, the real ontology and real mythology. That might be that might just pick up when Jim comes back. A lot of the themes that we've been talking about, because this idea of real mythology and the hermeneutic imperative of demythologization, all this hermeneutic stuff, this is really Jim's wheelhouse. Oh, and in fact, it's a very short chapter, pages 203 to 214. So maybe we could just do this chapter of like 3 sections, and if that's enough material, then so be it. And if not, then we can kind of hear what Jim has to say. Like, I would like to hear more about the matter radiating and all this stuff, especially because, like, Jim's really into light. Conrad-Martius says, in order for there to be light, light must meet light, or something like that. And I think she formulates it like that in different ways as well at different points. But I've just been thinking about that proposition 24 of the Book of the 24 Philosophers, that this God, this infinite sphere, has a light that does not refract. So it's really like an absolute framework. So, yeah. So let's say 2 weeks from now, not next Friday, but the one after that, and we'll look at all of chapter 6 and maybe return to some of the themes from this section, since chapter 6 is really about like interpreting exactly that kind of material. So what we did today is what we'll talk about when we do chapter 6.
I'm also wondering, I don't know if others are tired, but I really feel like we could maybe not indefinitely, but maybe spend more time, maybe one more session, really looking at this, like that diagram, the circles, and the idea of the Aeonic World-Periphery and what that is even all about.
Right.
And it really does look like that is that he and she build on that in developing these theological or religious dimensions that it has. But I still feel, and I feel like I've got some of it, but I'm kind of shaky on what it is supposed to be in the first place. And I guess what I keep coming back to is, I think finally it's trying to explain things that are obvious to us, but are mysterious. Like, what does it even mean for an individual being to be what it is in time in its development?
Yeah.
And in order to understand that, that's really what all this is at least rooted in.
Yeah.
And
well, I would like to spend some time in either Manchester's or Conrad-Martius's description of these antinomies of time. So it's interesting to know what the problems are, I think. And so I'd be interested in just spending some time reviewing either what Manchester or Conrad-Martius says, indeed cite, about that.
We skipped the section passing time on our first pass when we were back in chapter 2. Maybe
I keep going back to it.
Yeah, maybe it would be good to make our next meeting about passing time and topics related to that, and we can really think about the diagram. I'm totally down with that. I mean, we'll get to chapter 6 soon enough, and I think it is nice to, we could use the hermeneutical function of distantiation here, and let those those myths of matter radiating, maybe they're scientific myths, in Conrad-Martius's framework, let those simmer, and really have a nice hard analytic look at the antinomies of time. I could circulate some Manchester as well. I think the way he starts his book is really nice and intuitive. And by the way, like, not to give us so much homework, but I did send around this weird little book. Jeremy, did you see this?
No?
I sent a PDF out, so I can send it again. It's simply called Unfeeling Good, an operating manual for the human consciousness by Samuel McLaughlin. The subtitle is all of this: being a discourse on the high states of consciousness in relation to the fourth, fifth, and sixth dimensions, with special reference to the possibility of inner development and the value of esoteric knowledge and the nature of time and immortality. It's so it's a far out, tiny little book. But in fact, this book, and I've been looking at this kind of literature, hyperspace and all that sort of stuff forever. I'm really into like the idea of not just the fourth dimension, but all of them and what they could possibly mean. This cute little book explains it like really well and lays out like some really cool thought experiments about what the fourth, but also the fifth and the sixth space-time dimensions might be like. And in a way, it's kind of like the if the fourth dimension is like this next level up, then this is like what is it called, like the actual, and this is like the possible actual, and then maybe a fifth would be like the possible or something, like, remember Jim was like talking using these plenonastic formulations. If you think of it like that, this book I think lays out some pretty cool ways in which we might conceive of yet still higher dimensions. Because I mean, bearing in mind, Conrad-Martius is not just talking about the real world, the natural world, and the Aeonic world, but also this apyric world, which is yet another kind of deeper dimensionality. It might not exactly be the fifth or the sixth, but it might be like infinite height and this ultimate interiority at the same time. That's my perspective on it. So anyway, this is like a cute little book, but I'll circulate some Manchester. And why don't we see if we can get Jim in here as well, and we'll look at the definitions of time and in the phenomenological perspective, and get a good sense of like, what is the nature of time and how does this diagram of eternity help?
Well, the section on passing time for a paper that I'm trying to write, I actually went through that section and tried to summarize it. So I can put that together and send that out as well.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah. Yeah, very good. That's just pages 71 to 78. So yeah, I think maybe that's what we should do. How's that sound?
Yeah.
And then this will bring us back to a kind of review of the chapter that we're leaving now.
And then we shouldn't forget that, according to Jim, the perhaps the most important part of Conrad-Martius is her conception of nature. And we have pretty much completely forgotten about nature entirely. And I don't really know what her views of nature are.
Apparently, time is part of nature, according to Conrad-Martius.
Okay.
Which is kind of different from Husserl. And I don't understand that either. But according to her, I think yeah. And I think that's kind of what I was getting at before. If we think about the relationship between time and the realization of potentiality, and there's obviously a very close relationship between time and the realization of potentiality. And what makes natural beings natural is that they exist and develop by realizing the potentiality that constitutes their essence. So I think that is the relationship between time and nature, because time is the realization of potentiality and potentiality is nature.
And nature is phusis, and phu, the root of phusis, has this onomatopoetic, it phooses out. It's like oozing,
Right.
like like a flower, a futon, you know, and it's unfolding and opening up, and you know, and according to Manchester, his book is all about phusis, and it's foozing out according to the syntax of time, which is also going to be specified into like a human syntax of time, and a hummingbird's syntax of time, and a plant syntax of time, you know. But this is all to ground it in the idea of phusis as, you know, as nature in that sense.
So it's interesting about the time, because what we haven't talked much about, but we've referred to it, is Conrad-Martius's relationship with Heidegger. We know it's there, but we haven't really tried to be explicit about it. But he's talking about, well, later, a little bit later in the 30s, he's talking about this physis, and about, but his is dark, completely dark. It's the earth. You don't know anything about it. It's the soil where the roots go down into, but it's completely mysterious and dark and unknowable. But out of it comes everything. So Conrad-Martius has better eyes. She has better optics than Heidegger.
There is one dissertation by a student of both of them on their philosophies. And it's really difficult for us to get our hands on it. Even Rodney and the folks in the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists, they would only let you have the like table of contents and the first like 24 pages of it. So I have a number of agents attempting to get the actual dissertation.
Dark figures working at night.
I'll just throw out another title. I found this recently while reading the Franz Xavier von Bader book.
Oh, this is one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, so I just got it. I recommend it. It looks really cool. I'm gonna check it out. There's a lot on Bergson and Heidegger, Husserl, and more ancient figures. Seems pretty comprehensive. And then also, you know, in these earlier chapters, we were looking at a big discussion about preformatism versus the intellectual perspective versus the epigenetic perspective, and all this stuff in like, you know, early genetic theory and evolution, you know, Darwin versus like other thinkers and stuff. I also want to recommend this. I've started reading this. This is one of the Steiner folk. He'll refer to Steiner all the time. This is very much, you know, anthroposophical spiritual science, but he's also like the founder of his own way of thinking, and he doesn't just accept everything that Steiner says, but he you know, he supports a lot of it. Anyway, Embryology and World Evolution. This is a really far out book, and it starts with a really cool explanation of preformatism and the contemporary preformatism that we kind of all naturally fall into with genetics and the idea that chromosomes determine what we are and stuff. You know, so there's preformatism and the epigenetic view, and he gets into the difference between like creation, which is this more theological notion, versus genesis, or you know, something unfolding or generating from its own material. So anyway, it's a really cool perspective on embryological thinking. So Carl Koenig, that guy.
And so Conrad-Martius's view in the chapter we supposedly just reviewed speaks of generation. And so the creation is the creation of this entire world clock, whatever you want to call it, with all its potentialities and intellecties and like that. That's the creation. But after that, it's on its own. I mean, she almost has a deistic view of the relationship between God and the creation.
Well, you know, Hart mentions a few important theologians. I can't remember if it was Augustine, Aquinas, or who it was at the moment, but, you know, there's a very orthodox view that
the seminal view.
Yeah, there's this creatio ex nihilo. So there's this ultimate creation, you know, like the creation of the cosmos in total, or the creation of that world clock. But then as it ticks around, that's not creation then. That's this different thing called genesis, or unfolding, or maybe that was, I was reading that in here, but in our section of, from the
Mhm.
reading, you'll recall. Yeah,
Because of generation, I think.
yeah, generation, right. So that's consonant with what's being articulated here. And what's cool about that is, you know, the geneticists have a lot to say about generation and that kind of unfolding activity. And certainly embryology would be a great example of that unfolding of all the folds of, you know, the organs. But you know, the creation gets to be like something you can add on as an outside factor, you know, because Genesis doesn't reach so far as the theological conceptions of creation. So, like I was saying before, you know, the finite can't encompass the infinite, but the infinite does encompass the finite. So we can like be, you know, God can be dead and we can be spiritually blind or whatever, you know, is the modern problematic. But and we can develop a lot of stuff with just with the finite, but you know, we can always bring back that that bigger spiritual attitude, you know, and we can also do it without it being this naive, you know, primary naivete. It can be a secondary or transformed naivete, as Paul Ricoeur calls it, for instance. Or actually Jim calls it that too, in the beginning of his translation of Husserl.
I've got to get going. So
yeah,
I really enjoyed
Okay,
it though.
let's
Yeah.
all go.
Yeah,
All right,
yeah.
we'll
Okay.
see you in
Have
a
a good
couple
one.
of weeks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. God bless.
So are we